Good afternoon, students. Today is Thursday, 15 April 2021. Today is the final day on Chapter 7, and when we meet again next week for the first lecture, we'll take up Chapter 8. We're going to spend 2 days on Chapter 8, although there's only a little bit of reading in Chapter 8 that I'd like you to do. I would like you to read the first 3 pages of Chapter 8. Which is the section entitled The Formula of Autonomy, I believe. I don't have it here with me. I believe it's entitled The Formula of Autonomy. In fact, let me look at the reading list. Oh, sorry, The Formula of the End in Itself. So those 3 pages I would like you to read for the first lecture next week. Now, I'm going to be posting a handout for you, which is some reading by Kant. I want you to actually read some of Kant for the next part of the course, for next week, the second lecture next week. So I'll be posting that in the next few days, probably by tomorrow. Okay, so today we're finishing Chapter 7, and then we'll take up Chapter 8 next week. We have 2 days on Kant next week, and then there will be only 3 lectures remaining in the whole course. And all 3 of them will be devoted to the theory that I call Rossian pluralism. Okay, and don't forget the exam is on the 11th of May. The 11th of May. So make sure you put that on your calendar. It occurred to me that one of the downsides to these online lectures is the following. And it was suggested to me by something a student said recently. If I were teaching in a classroom, then of course I would be giving my lecture on a particular day at a particular time, and everyone would be expected to be there to hear my lecture. And there would be no way for anybody to watch that lecture or listen to that lecture later. It's a one-off, right? If you're not there to hear it, then the very best you can do is get lecture notes from somebody else who was there. It occurred to me recently that with this online format, someone might try the following. Someone might try to watch several of my videos in the day or 2 preceding the exam. Okay, that would be a grave error. Let me explain why. Suppose you put off watching the videos until 2 days before the exam. Now, you may think that you will have time in the final 2 days to watch 4 or 5 videos, which would be probably over 4 or 5 hours. But what if something came up on that next to last day or on the last day before the exam? Then you are in trouble because this thing came up, you don't have time to watch my lectures. And that's a problem. So make sure you don't put off watching my lectures until just before the exam. In fact, you should be watching them all along as you go, pretty close to the time when I post them. So for example, I'm going to be posting this particular lecture as soon as I'm done, or at least sometime later today, and you should watch it very soon after it's posted. When you get the email from me telling you that the video is now posted, you should make a note to yourself and get in there and watch it very soon. Don't put it off. All right, so that's a problem with this online format. Students may be tempted to watch several videos just before the exam. And the problem is if something comes up in your life, if you're sick, for example, you may be unable to watch the videos, or something comes up in your family that may take you away from your work. Maybe your boss requires that you work that day when you didn't expect to. Lots of things can happen. So please, for your own good, watch the videos as you go, not all at once at the end. Okay, so that takes care of some odds and ends. Now today's lecture shouldn't take even 1 hour. And the reason for that is we're finishing up Kant's 4 examples. We've covered the first 2, and we've got 2 to go. And then Remember, I asked you to read the final section of Feldman's chapter 7 entitled More Examples. I asked you to read that. It's only a few pages long, and I'm going to discuss 3 additional examples with you today. Examples, 2 of which Feldman thinks pose a problem for Kant's theory. Remember, Kant called his theory the categorical imperative. I don't know that he ever called it a theory, but I'm calling it a theory because it's clearly meant to be a rival of other theories like utilitarianism. Okay? So let's get to the 3rd example from Kant. I'm going to be reading it from this handout that I posted for you. This one is on page 2 of the handout. And Kant, as usual, devotes 1 full paragraph to this example. So I think we should start just by reading it, and then we'll spend a few minutes discussing it. And eventually, I want to come over to this other handout that I made for you and walk you through it, through Kant's analysis of it. Remember, all 4 of Kant's examples are such that he thinks that the act in question is wrong. And by wrong, he means contrary to duty. Okay? In all 4 examples, he thinks the act in question turns out to be wrong. And the examples are a diverse lot. One of the examples, the first one, is what Kant calls a perfect duty to oneself, and that is the duty not to kill yourself. The second example involves a perfect duty to others. You mustn't lie to others, and that includes making a lying promise, a false promise, where you know at the time you make the promise that you won't be able to keep it. That's a special type of lie, right? You're lying about your own intentions. You're letting the other person believe that you intend to repay the money, but in fact, you do not intend to repay it because you know you won't be able to repay it. So it's a particular type of lie. It's called a lying promise. The third example that we're about to discuss in a moment is an example of an imperfect duty to oneself. And the fourth example, which we'll take up in a few minutes, is an example of an imperfect duty to others. Okay, so here we go. Example 3. Kant writes, and again, this is translated from the original German into English. A third finds in himself a talent which could, by means of some cultivation, make him in many respects a useful man. But he finds himself in comfortable circumstances and prefers indulgence in pleasure to troubling himself with broadening and improving his fortunate natural gifts. Now, however, let him ask whether his maxim of neglecting his gifts, besides agreeing with his propensity to idle amusement, agrees also with what is called duty. He sees that a system of nature could indeed exist in accordance with such a law, even though man, like the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands, should let his talents rust and resolve to devote his life merely to idleness, indulgence, and propagation. In a word, to pleasure. But he cannot possibly will that this should become a universal law of nature, or that it should be implanted in us by a natural instinct. Why? Because as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all his faculties should be developed, inasmuch as they are given to him for all sorts of possible purposes. So that's it. That's all Kant says about this example. He thinks that this is another example of a wrong act, an act that is contrary to duty. And why does he believe it's wrong? Because the agent in question cannot consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a universal law of nature. Now, the first 2 examples arrived at the same conclusion in that they both said that there cannot be a world in which such and such is the case. In examples 3 and 4, Kant admits that the world could be in a certain way, but that the agent cannot will it to be that way. So the two examples of imperfect duty arrive at the same conclusion as the first two, but for a different reason. And you can see that from the flow chart that I prepared for you. You'll see that there are two boxes with the word no in it, here and here. And that shows you that the act is wrong in both of those boxes, but for a different reason. Okay, in examples 1 and 2, let me repeat it. In examples 1 and 2, the maxim cannot be a law of nature. In examples 3 and 4, the maxim can be a law of nature, but the agent cannot will it to be a law of nature. All right? So let me comment on this example before we look at the other handout. Notice that the act in question is neglecting his gifts. There's a particular man in this example, and he's well off, and he wants to experience pleasure. He finds that he has certain talents. It could be, Kant doesn't tell us what those talents are. They could be artistic talents, musical, for example, talents. They could be athletic talents. They could be intellectual talents. They could be certain skills, such as gardening or home construction. Right? It could be any talent that a human being could have. Kant doesn't tell us what it is. And the man says, I'm tempted to just neglect my gifts and not develop any of my talents. But the man wants to do the right thing and wants to avoid doing the wrong thing. So he asks himself, would it be wrong of me to neglect my talents or my gifts that I happen to have? So the maxim is something like, when I'm inclined to neglect my gifts or talents, I shall do so. When I'm inclined to let my talents rust, I shall do so. Now, what's the generalized form of that maxim? Something like this. Whenever anyone is inclined to be lazy or to let his or her talents rust, he or she shall do so. So the first question we ask is, can that generalized form of the maxim be a universal law of nature? And this time, unlike the first two times, Kant says yes. Yes, there could be a world in which people let their talents rust. There could be a world in which people neglect to develop their talents or their gifts. Okay? There's no contradiction in such a world, Kant says. But the issue is still open. We now have to ask the second question. Can this man who's thinking of neglecting his gifts, can he consistently will that his talents remain undeveloped? Kant says no. Kant says as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all his faculties should be developed. That's part of what it means to be rational, according to Kant anyway. Right? Being a rational being means that you will to develop your talents. Okay? Now, many philosophers have criticized Kant for this. In fact, there's a couple of strange features of this. Kant assumes that rational beings like you and me necessarily, by our very nature, will to develop our talents. Well, there are two puzzles. Why are the South Sea Islanders, therefore, not developing their talents? If human beings, if rational beings necessarily will to develop their talents, then there can't be any human beings anywhere who don't. And yet Kant's own example tells us that there are people on a South Sea Island who live lives of indulgence and luxury and pleasure seeking, hedonism. They live hedonistic lives. They lie in hammocks all day. They pluck fruit from a tree when they're hungry and drink from the nearby stream when they're thirsty. Instead of doing things to develop their talents, they're just enjoying the good life, a hedonistic life. So the first puzzle is this. If Kant thinks that rational beings are necessarily will to the development of their talents, then how could there be these South Sea Islanders or anyone else who are living without developing their talents? That's deeply puzzling. And Feldman points that out in chapter 7. Now, the second strange feature is this. Kant says that we have a duty morally to develop our talents. What's the point of saying we have a duty to do something that we necessarily do? I mean, Kant says right here that rational beings necessarily will to develop their talents. And so what's the point of saying we have a duty to do it? Ordinarily, when you say that somebody has a duty to do something, that implies that the person may or may not do it, and we're trying to get the person to do it by saying you have a duty to do it. Here, Kant tells us that people necessarily, by their very nature, will to develop their talents. Then what's the point of saying we have a duty to do it? It would be a pointless thing to say you have a duty to develop your talents, when at the same time you're assuming that they necessarily will to develop their talents. So there's a lot that's puzzling in this example by Kant. In fact, it's been puzzling all along. Kant, who was undoubtedly a brilliant man, a genius, in this little book wrote up 4 examples that he thought were clear and obvious, and he thought all 4 examples confirm his theory. Philosophers today shake their heads in wonder because his examples don't seem clear, and to the extent that they are clear, they don't seem to support his theory. So there's a lot of puzzlement over Kant's examples. You may wonder why we're going over it if it's so puzzling and if there's so much debate about it, but sometimes you have to go back and read the original text. Kant's theory has been tremendously influential. And when we get to next week and look at chapter 8, you'll see that the second formulation of Kant's theory is much clearer and easier to understand than this first formulation that we're now discussing. And many people believe that the second formulation is intuitively attractive. And you'll make up your mind about that next week when we go over it. Now, I've already pretty much gone through this example, this handout. If you look at page 2 of this handout, it's in the middle of the page right here. It says, let act A sub 3, letting all his talents rust. That's the act that we're discussing. Then I have the maxim of that act. And then in the third column, I have the generalized form of the maxim. And then I ask the question at the top of the heading, at the top of the handout, is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? Kant's answer is yes. The state of affairs in question is not at all self-contradictory. Right? It's a coherent, consistent state of the world in which people routinely neglect their gifts. Next question, slide over to the 5th column. Can the agent consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim be a universal law? Kant's answer, no. Okay, and that's what makes the act wrong, this no answer. So let's read what I wrote in the box. According to Kant, the agent would have a contradictory will. The agent would be willing both to develop his talents, which all rational beings have, and he would be willing to let his talents rust as well. So this man would have an inconsistent will. He is simultaneously willing that everyone develop his or her talents. He's simultaneously willing that nobody develop his or her talents and that he develop his talents. That he let his talents rust. Okay? Let me say that whole thing again. I still think it's confusing. The agent would be willing the following: to develop his talents, because that's what all rational beings do necessarily, and to let his talents rust. Okay, I finally got it clear. Sorry about the first two. If I could edit this video, I would. Okay, do you see what I've written in there? The man is contradicting his will. He's got an inconsistent will. He's willing inconsistently. On the one hand, as a rational being, he necessarily wills that his talents be developed. But on the other hand, being lazy by nature, he wills to let his talents go undeveloped, to let them rust. So he's got an inconsistent will, and that's what makes the act wrong this time, unlike the first two examples. So if you look at the final column, here's what I wrote. The normative status of the act, according to Kant, is that it's wrong. It's contrary to duty. And he goes on later in his book to say, rational beings have an imperfect or positive duty to perfect themselves. That means to develop their rational capacities. The act in question, which is letting one's talents rust, is contrary to this duty. So Kant believes that each of us has a duty to ourselves, not to others, but to ourselves, to develop our talents. Why is this considered an imperfect duty? We'll go back to the meaning of that. Imperfect duties are duties that allow exceptions for inclination. Perfect duties do not allow any exceptions for inclination. So the idea here is that if you have more than one talent, you can choose which of them to develop, how to develop it, over what time period to develop it. So imperfect duties like this one allow for the agent to have discretion. You get to decide. But notice, you still have a duty. If you did nothing at any point to develop any of your talents, you would be violating your duty to yourself. All right? So with perfect duties, there are certain things you must not do no matter what, like tell a lying promise and killing yourself. With imperfect duties, you have to do something. That's why it's called a positive duty rather than a negative duty. And the thing that you have a duty to do allows for discretion. You get to choose how to discharge your duty, when, why, and to whom. Okay, you get to make some choices along the way. All right, let's move on to the fourth and final example that Kant provides. This one has to do with giving to charity. Remember, the word charity comes from a Latin word that means love. And you can see why we call it charity. When people give to charities, like the Salvation Army or the Red Cross, they're motivated by love. Or if you find that term inappropriate in this context, you could think of it, instead of love, you could think of it as compassion or concern or caring. Right? So charity means your motivation is to do good for others. It's a form of beneficence or benevolence. Right? Benevolence is the motive with which you act, and beneficence is the act of doing good for others. So according to Kant, each of us has a duty of charity, but it's imperfect because we get to decide to whom we provide assistance and exactly what type of assistance we provide and over what time period and so on. We have to do good in this world, according to Kant, but we get to decide the parameters and the details. So let me begin, as I've been doing, by reading Kant's fourth paragraph, and then we'll talk about it briefly, and then eventually we'll come back to this handout. Okay, a fourth man, for whom things are going well, sees that others whom he could help have to struggle with great hardships, and he asks, "What concern of mine is it? Let each one be as happy as heaven wills, or as he can make himself. I will not take anything from him or even envy him. But to his welfare or to his assistance in time of need, I have no desire to contribute." Now that's a long-winded way of saying what? There's someone who says, I know there are people who are struggling and suffering and who have needs that are unfulfilled, and I also know that I'm in a position to help them. But I'm not going to. I'm going to let them fend for themselves, and I'm willing to do that myself. Right? I think everyone perhaps should fend for him or herself. All right, let's continue with Kant's actual words. If such a way of thinking were a universal law of nature, certainly the human race could exist, and without doubt, even better than in a state where everyone talks of sympathy and goodwill, or even exerts himself occasionally to practice them, while on the other hand, he cheats when he can and betrays or otherwise violates the rights of man. Now, although it is possible that a universal law of nature a universal law of nature according to that maxim could exist, it is nevertheless impossible to will that such a principle should hold everywhere as a law of nature. Why? Because a will which resolved this would conflict with itself. Since, and here's his reason, instances can often arise in which he would need the love and sympathy of others, and in which he would have robbed himself by such a law of nature springing from his own will of all hope of the aid he desires. So that's Kant's fourth example. What's the basic situation? A man is wondering whether he should help other people who are in need, and he has the means to do so. And he's inclined not to help, but he wants to do the right thing. So he asks himself whether he can consistently will that not giving to charity be a law of nature. And he concludes that he cannot consistently will that to be a universal law of nature. Why? Because he himself one day may need assistance. After all, people go broke, people go bankrupt, people lose everything. He may be living well now. He may have more resources than he needs now, but who knows what the future will hold. Something terrible could happen. Huge medical expenses could end up depleting his life savings. Maybe his business will go under and he'll be out of work. Then he will need assistance from someone. And Kant says then he's going to be in a predicament because he has already willed that nobody help other people when in need. He can't, therefore, consistently will that he receive assistance should he ever need it. That would be an inconsistent will, where on the one hand you will that nobody help anybody, but you will that you be helped by somebody. That's a contradiction in the will, according to Kant. And therefore, it's wrong to fail to give to charity. It's wrong to fail to help other people when you can do so and when they're in need. So, I'm done with this handout now. I used this handout to read Kant's actual words in all four examples. Let's look at this handout now, which I prepared for you, and we're going to walk through it from left to right. What is the act in question? And on page 113, Feldman says the act, which he calls A sub 4, is, quote, giving nothing to charity, unquote. Okay, the act is giving nothing to charity. What's the maxim? What would be the subjective principle of volition for that man? And Feldman tells us on the same page, it goes like this: when I'm flourishing and others are in distress, I shall give nothing to charity. So that's his actual maxim. Okay? Notice the maxim is his understanding of the situation and of the action. Let's now generalize the maxim in the third column. Whenever anyone is flourishing and others are in distress, he will give nothing to charity. Okay, that's the generalized form. Now, the fourth column has a question at the top. Is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? Kant's answer, yes. Yes, it is. The state of affairs in question, where nobody helps anyone else, is a coherent, consistent, non-self-contradictory state of affairs. There could be a world like that. There could be a world where people look after their own needs and no one else's. Okay? But we're not done yet. We have to ask the next question. Go to the top of column 5. Can the agent can this man consistently will that his maxim be a universal law of nature? And this time the answer is no. He cannot will it. Here's what I wrote in there. If the agent were to will that, the agent would be willing two things. The first is that he should be given aid, should he ever need it, and that nobody be given any aid. And that's contradictory. You can't will both that nobody give any aid and that you receive aid should you ever need it. That is a contradictory will. You're willing inconsistently. Therefore, the maxim of this act is not universalizable, and therefore, since an act is right if and only if its maxim is universalizable, this act is wrong. Look at the final column. Here's what I wrote. The act is wrong. Rational beings have an imperfect or positive duty to love others. Remember, love means be concerned about or care about, i.e. to make others' ends their own. So you have ends, I have ends, everyone has ends. Some of our ends are the same, other people's ends differ. Right? Some ends differ. Some people have as an end becoming a great athlete or a great scholar, but not everybody has that end. Okay? So people have different ends. What Kant believes is that each of us should adopt other people's ends as if they were our own. And that means that you should do things to promote their own ends. Now, there are limits to that. Kant says very clearly, although not on this handout, Kant says very clearly, if someone else's ends are immoral, we have no duty to help them pursue those ends. So suppose your end happens to be to become the world's greatest mass murderer. Not the world's greatest cyclist, but the world's greatest mass murderer. I have no duty, perfect or imperfect, to promote that end. Why? Because it's inherently immoral. So really what Kant is saying is each of us has a duty, a moral duty, to promote the morally permissible ends of others. And that's what love is, right? You want to help other people pursue their goals, achieve their ends, and so forth. One of which is happiness, by the way. Kant believed that we humans do pursue happiness. Unlike utilitarians, Kant did not believe that that's what makes acts right or wrong. Right? But he has nothing against happiness. In fact, he believes that we by nature pursue it. And it's a good thing when we are happy, according to Kant. It's just that that's not what makes actions right or wrong, in his view. So let's continue reading what I wrote in the box. The act in question, namely giving nothing to charity, is contrary to this duty. If you fail to give to charity, you are failing to fulfill your duty to make other people's ends your own. And Kant points out that failure to love others is not a vice, but it is a lack of virtue. So a virtue is a positive thing, vice is a negative thing, but it's possible for an act to be neither a vice nor a virtue. So if you simply fail to be charitable to others, you lack a virtue, the virtue of love or benevolence. That doesn't mean you're vicious. That doesn't mean you have a vice. It just means you fail to have a virtue that you should have. Okay, so that takes care of Kant's 4 examples. Once again, Kant believed that all 4 of these examples produce the same result, namely that the act in question is wrong, by which he meant contrary to duty. Other philosophers who have examined his 4 examples, like Feldman, are not persuaded. They think that either his examples aren't clear enough, or when they are clear, they produce the wrong result. All right, let's look at some further examples. You'll notice The final section of Feldman's Chapter 7 is entitled More Examples. And I just want to discuss, there are three of them there, and I want to discuss them with you because two of them, Feldman thinks, count against Kant's theory. Two of them are counter examples, according to Feldman, to Kant's theory. It's unfortunate that Kant's not here to respond. I would love to read what Feldman wrote to Kant and let him reply to it. That would be a wonderful thing, but of course that'll never happen. All we can do is put ourselves in Kant's shoes and try to figure out what he would say. So let's look at the next example. It's on page 3 of my 4-page handout. This is page 3, and the one I'm looking at is right here in the middle. It's Act A sub 5. So here's the situation. A young woman known as Miss Perkins, who's a student in a university like you, she has a term paper assignment coming up, and primarily out of laziness, she doesn't expect to get the assignment done, and even if she did, she would expect a poor grade. She's not prepared for the assignment, so she considers purchasing a term paper online. Or I guess it doesn't have to be online, but that's the way things are done these days. So she's thinking about submitting a store-bought term paper. Let's call it a store-bought term paper. In other words, she's not doing her own work. She's paying someone to prepare a term paper for her, which she will turn into the professor as her own work. Now, obviously, that goes against the professor's rules, as you can imagine. So here is the act. It's A sub 5. On page 114, Feldman describes the act as follows: submitting the phony term paper. For some reason, Feldman spelled the word phony P-H-O-N-E-Y. And clearly it's P-H-O-N-Y. It looks like a typo. Okay, so the act in question is Miss Perkins submitting a phony term paper, a store-bought term paper. Now, what is the maxim of Ms. Perkins' act? What is her understanding of the situation and of what she's doing in that situation? On page 115, Feldman tells us the maxim. Here it is. When I need a term paper for a course and don't feel like writing one, I shall buy a term paper and submit it as my own work. Okay, that's the maxim. That's her understanding of what she's doing. Here's the generalized form of the maxim of that act. Whenever anyone needs a term paper for a course and doesn't feel like writing one, she will buy one and submit it as her own work. Okay? So it's just a generalized form. So here's the first question. There are always two questions. The first question, and you can go back to the original page and look at the heading of the fourth column, is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? Now, I wrote in this box, undetermined. Feldman does not even address this first question. He skips right over to the second question. And because he thinks the second question has a clear answer. So all I wrote in the box is undetermined. The answer could be either yes or no without affecting the result. What I mean by that is the second answer, the second question is going to determine the rightness or wrongness of the act all by itself. The first question turned out to be irrelevant, unimportant. So let's turn to the second question. Go back to the original first page, look at the fifth column. Here's the question that we now need to ask. Can the agent, meaning Ms. Perkins, consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of her act be a universal law? In other words, is her maxim universalizable? And if you look at the box, you'll see that the answer is no. No, it's not universalizable, and therefore her act of submitting a phony term paper is wrong. But why? Why can't Ms. Perkins consistently will that anyone who has a term paper assignment submit a phony term paper. Well, here's what I wrote in the box. Let's begin with that. No, she can't consistently will it. Why? The agent, Ms. Perkins, would be willing both of the following things. She would be willing both that the system remain as it is. Why? So that her cheating pays off, and that the system change, which it would if the generalized form of the maxim were to become a universal law. Now, let's put our hand out now and think this through. What is going on here? Ms. Perkins is trying to take advantage of the system as it's currently set up. The professor collects term papers from the students on the assumption that each student has prepared that term paper. The professor reads and evaluates them and assigns a grade or a score to them. Okay, that's the system that's in place. Ms. Perkins is trying to exploit the system. She wants the system to stay in place, but she wants to submit a store-bought term paper and get a good grade rather than submit one of her own. Okay? But at the same time, what's going to happen if everyone routinely submitted a store-bought term paper? The professor would realize eventually that the students are not doing their own work, and the professor would change the system. The professor might now require in-class exams rather than submission of term papers. And the reason for that is the professor can keep an eye on you when you're in the classroom writing an essay exam, for example. So what would happen if the generalized form of the maxim of Ms. Perkins' Act were to become a universal law of nature? The whole system of grading would change, and there would therefore be nothing for her to exploit or take advantage of. So she's got an inconsistent will. She wants the system to stay the same so that she can take advantage of it, but at the same time, her maxim, she's willing that her maxim be a universal law of nature, which is going to end up changing the system. So put them together. She's simultaneously willing that the system stay the same and that the system change. And that's a contradiction. You cannot will both that something stay as it is and that it change. Okay? That's an inconsistency in the will. So what's the verdict? If you look at the final column, we get the verdict that the act is wrong, i.e., contrary to duty. Now, Feldman, if you keep reading, Feldman believes that Kant's theory, CI1, gives the correct result in this case. He says on page 114, most of us would say that the act is morally wrong. Now, I'm hesitant to ask you, but I will. Is it your intuition, your considered judgment that Ms. Perkins would be acting wrongly if she bought a term paper and submitted it? I hope so. I hope you believe that would be a wrong thing to do, and that you would never consider doing something like that, which is a form of cheating to get a good grade. So according to Feldman, this example does support Kant's theory. Why? Because Kant's theory entails or implies that submitting a store-bought term paper is wrong, and that matches our intuition. So the theory gives us the right result in this case. This example confirms Kant's theory. Now you may be wondering, why would Feldman discuss this example? Shouldn't he be criticizing Kant's theory rather than confirming it? The answer is he's not done yet. He's going to modify the Miss Perkins example and get a different result that he thinks is a counterexample to Kant's theory. So let's change the facts a little bit and see what happens. Go down to the next row of my handout. This time, look at A sub 6, the sixth different act. On page 116, Feldman describes the act as submitting a store-bought term paper. Submitting a store-bought term paper. similar to the fifth act. What's the maxim? When I need a term paper for a course and I don't feel like writing one, and no change in the system will occur if he or she and no change in the system will occur if I submit a store-bought one, then I shall buy a term paper and submit it as my own work. Notice this time Miss Perkins has a different maxim. This time she builds into the maxim the idea that the system won't change. Because that's the problem from her point of view with the previous example, right? The system changed. Once she willed that everyone that everyone cheat, the professor changed the system, denying her the opportunity to exploit it. So Ms. Perkins is crafty. She simply changes her maxim. It now becomes part of her maxim that the system doesn't change as a result of her submitting a store-bought term paper. Okay, what's the generalized form of her maxim? Whenever anyone needs a term paper for a course and doesn't feel like writing one, and no change in the system will occur if he or she submits a store-bought one, then he or she shall buy a term paper and submit it as his or her own work. And I put a note in there that I supplied that generalized form. I searched in vain for Feldman's statement of the generalized form of the maxim. He didn't supply it, so I came up with it myself. Okay, first question, go back to the first page. Is the generalized form of the maxim capable of being a universal law? Answer, yes. The state of affairs in question is not self-contradictory. There's no contradiction in a world in which everyone submits a store-bought term paper and no change in the system occurs. There could be a world like that, a coherent, consistent world. But we're not done yet, because we now have to ask that next question. Can Ms. Perkins consistently will that the generalized form of her maxim be a universal law of nature? And the answer is yes. She can will it, because the inconsistency in the previous example occurred because the professor changed the system as a result of her turning in a fake paper, a phony paper. But now that she's built into the maxim itself that no change will occur, she can consistently will it. There's no contradiction in her willing both that everyone turn in a term paper when no change will occur to the system, and that she turn in a term paper and take advantage of the system. Okay? And what do you get if you go back to this handout? Both questions have been answered yes, and we end up here. And what do you see in there? The act is right. The act is in accordance with duty. Okay? So now that we've tinkered with the maxim, the act turned out to be right rather than wrong. And that's weird, isn't it? Ms. Perkins turned her wrong act into a right act just by fudging her maxim. She built into her maxim the idea that no change occurs in the system. And if you read what I wrote in the final box, it says, Feldman believes that CI gives the incorrect result in this case. Feldman writes on page 116, the result seems wrong. So what's going on now in this example? According to Feldman, Kant's theory implies that Miss Feldman's act is right. Intuitively, we shake our head no. It's not right to turn in a fake term paper to get a good grade, a phony term paper. It's not right to cheat. So Kant's theory, according to Feldman, has produced an incorrect result. And that must count against Kant's theory. Anything that implies a falsehood is false. Kant's theory implies a falsehood, namely that it's right for Miss Perkins to submit a phony term paper. Therefore, Kant's theory is false. Once again, anything that implies a falsehood is false. Kant's theory implies a falsehood. Therefore, Kant's theory is false. So Feldman introduced this example of Miss Perkins to make a point. His point is that you can rig Kant's theory to get whatever result you want. Miss Perkins, who must be pretty smart, said, I want to do right according to Kant's theory. She understood Kant's theory well enough to know that if she tinkered with her maxim, she could get the result that it's right for her to turn in a phony term paper. Pretty nifty, huh? Miss Perkins says, I should get a good grade just for that. By understanding Kant's theory so well that I could tinker with it and get whatever result I want, I should get an A in the course. So, according to Feldman, here we have an example of an act that is universalizable, but it's wrong. And that is a counterexample to Kant's theory. Because remember that according to Kant's theory, an act is right if and only if its maxim is universalizable. Here we have a case where the maxim is universalizable, and yet intuitively the act seems to be wrong. So it's a counterexample to Kant's theory, according to Feldman. Now we have one more example. It's on page 4 of this handout. It's also discussed by Feldman. It's not about a term paper. It's about a man who has money invested in the stock market. And he's worried that the stock market is going to crash, so he's thinking about withdrawing his money. In fact, he formulates a maxim or rule that when the stock market goes down to a certain point, he's going to withdraw all of his money from the bank. So let's walk our way through the example and reach a result. And then we'll talk about why Feldman discusses this example at all. Here's the act. It's A sub 7 on page 116. The act is removing his money from the bank. Okay, the man has money in the bank and he's thinking of removing it. What is his maxim? In other words, what does he take himself to be doing? Feldman says it's this: when the stock market index reaches 1,000, I shall withdraw all my money from the bank. So suppose the market has been falling over a period of days or weeks. The man is getting scared that the value of his investment is going to disappear altogether. So he says, look, if that market goes down to 1,000, I'm going to the bank and taking all my money out. When the stock market reaches 1,000, I shall withdraw all my money from the bank. What's the generalized form of that maxim? Feldman tells us on page 116, whenever the stock market index reaches 1,000, everyone shall withdraw all of their money from the bank. Now that's bad grammar. It should be his or her money to match the word everyone. Okay, so that's the generalized form of the maxim. Here's the first question. Is the generalized form capable of being a universal law? Answer, no. No, it's not. There can't be a world in which everyone withdraws his or her money from the bank. So here is what I wrote in the fourth column. No, the state of affairs in question is self-contradictory. Banks have loaned out most of the money deposited in them. If everyone came to withdraw their savings from their bank, banks would soon run out of money. Not everyone can withdraw simultaneously. So when you try to imagine a world in which everyone withdrew his or her savings at the same time, then that would be an impossibility. That would be a self-contradictory world because the banks don't have all that money on hand to pay the owners of it. I'm sure you know how banks work. When people put money into a bank as savings, the bank doesn't just put it in a vault or a safe and leave it there. The bank lends that money out at a certain interest rate. So the idea behind a bank is the bank takes in money for people and pays them a certain amount of interest on it. Let's say it's 2%. So depositors receive 2% interest on the money they deposit with the bank. The bank takes that money and lends it to other people for something more than 2% interest. Suppose they get 4%. The bank is taking the money from depositors, paying them 2% for it, and turning around and earning 4% with that same money. So the money isn't in the bank. The money has been lent to someone else who is using it for whatever purposes. So if everyone converged on the bank at the same time to withdraw money, the bank would be unable to comply with their request. The bank, in fact, would fail. That's what happened in the Great Depression early in the 20th century. People made a run on the bank because they were panic-stricken, and the banks failed. They fell like dominoes all over the country, and that just made things even worse. Depositors lost their money, banks went out of business, there was no money to be lent for people who had projects to complete, and so on. It had a ripple effect through the economy, and it lasted many years. The Great Depression, it's called. The country didn't start coming out of the Great Depression until the late 1930s, and in part because of some government programs that were instituted by the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected for the first time in 1932. Anyway, it's not a history course. You can read up on it on your own. And some of you may know about the Great Depression already. You should. So the answer to the first question is no. There cannot be a universal law of nature in which everyone withdraws his or her money when the stock market reaches a certain point. And therefore, we've already arrived at an answer to our question. The act in question is wrong. We don't even need to ask the second question. But let's go ahead anyway, since I filled it in. The second question is, can the agent consistently will it? And I wrote no. Since the state of affairs in question is self-contradictory, nobody, including the agent, can consistently will it. You can't consistently will impossible things. So we've got an impossible thing, and therefore no agent, including this investor or depositor, can consistently will it. What's the result according to Kant's theory? Look at the final column. The act turns out to be wrong, meaning contrary to duty. And I added the following. Feldman believes that Kant's theory, CI sub 1, gives the incorrect result in this case. And he writes, this act seems quite acceptable from the moral point of view, unquote. So let's analyze this. Feldman thinks he is now given an example that goes in the other direction. In the second Miss Perkins example, Feldman had a maxim that is universalizable but intuitively wrong, namely submitting a store-bought term paper. In this example, Feldman has described an act that is not universalizable, but turns out to be right, namely with the man withdrawing his the man withdrawing his savings. Intuitively, it's right to go to the bank and withdraw your savings. And you can have a rule like, whenever the stock market reaches a certain level, I'm going to withdraw my money from the bank. So intuitively, what that man is proposing to do, namely withdraw his money, is right. And yet, it comes out wrong according to Kant's theory. So something has gone haywire. Feldman thinks that Kant's theory gives wrong results in two different cases. Sometimes in a case where a maxim is universalizable, the act comes out to be wrong. And sometimes when a maxim comes out to be not universalizable, the act turns out to be right. So that's why Feldman has three additional examples. Two of them involve Miss Perkins. Feldman begins by giving a confirming example for Kant's theory, and then he modifies it to show that you can tinker with it and get the opposite result. And then Feldman discusses the case of the man withdrawing his money because that turns things around. Two different counterexamples to Kant's theory. So, what is Feldman's verdict on the first formulation of Kant's theory? I'm looking at the book. I have a copy of chapter 7 in my notebook. That's what I'm flipping through. Here's what Kant says. Kant says, I'm reading from page 117. Kant says, these absurd results show that there's a very deep problem with CI sub 1. The problem in general is that there are many different reasons why a maxim may fail to be universalizable. Some of these reasons have nothing whatsoever to do with morality. Yet, as far as can be discerned from the text of Kant's book, The Groundwork, Kant nowhere attempts to distinguish between innocent but non-universalizable maxims, like the man withdrawing his savings, and evil and non-universalizable ones on the other, like Ms. Perkins. Without such a distinction, CI sub 1 yields obviously incorrect results in innumerable cases. Final paragraph. So we can conclude that there are very serious problems with CI sub 1. Perhaps CI sub 1 is not an adequate interpretation of Kant's categorical imperative. In other words, maybe we haven't understood Kant. And maybe the reason why we haven't understood Kant is because he was such a bad writer. He wrote in an obscure way. He didn't explain things well enough. He didn't elaborate. And so we're left to guess what he meant. Feldman says, perhaps a more adequate version of that doctrine would not have these unsatisfactory results. However, if CI sub 1 is not Kant's theory, then it is very hard to see what Kant's theory might be. So, what is Feldman saying? At the end of this long chapter, which is just the first of 2 chapters on Kant, Feldman says, look, I've been as charitable as I can to Kant. I've tried hard to understand him and to state his theory correctly. And yet, when you do so, you find that his theory gives intuitively incorrect results in cases like Ms. Perkins and the investor or the depositor. And even some of Kant's own examples seem to give incorrect results. The suicide case, for example, maybe the lying promise case. So there are deep problems with Kant's theory. Whether some modern day Kantian can solve those problems remains to be seen. One reason there are so many people working on Kant today is because there's a general sense that Kant, being a brilliant man, was onto something. But because he was such a bad writer, there's disagreement about what he meant and how to fill in the gaps. And that gives people a chance to write articles and books, either defending Kant or criticizing Kant. There's today what you might call a Kant industry. There are journals like Kant Studies. Books continue to be published on various aspects of Kant's philosophy, including his ethics. Articles are continuing to pour out. In fact, I'm thinking right now of writing an article on Kant's view of suicide. Remember his first example? A man was thinking of killing himself. I've tracked down everything Kant wrote on the topic of suicide. And I'm going to try to make some sense of it in a published article. So we'll see whether I pursue that project. I'm in the early stages right now, but I may end up contributing to the literature on Kant. And my goal is to understand him as well as I can and to get him right. I want to be charitable to him. I don't want to just attack him for whatever motive. I want to get him right. I want to understand him. I want to learn from him eventually. Okay, that's enough for today. We're a little over an hour in. We're not done with Kant. We are done with chapter 7. We're going to read and discuss the first section of chapter 8 on the first lecture next week. And then I'm going to be posting an excerpt from Kant's books, and I'd like you to read it sometime before the second lecture next week. And my lecture will be on that supplemental reading. And it's on the reading list, in case you're wondering. This is not something new. You can see on the reading list, I wrote posted excerpts from two books, Kant's Groundwork, published in 1785, and The Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1797. So I've lifted a few pages from those two books. I'm going to post it on Canvas for you to read, and I'm going to lecture on it on the second day next week. And then we'll be done with Kant. And you're probably thinking, thank goodness. It's very difficult to lecture on Kant, as you may have surmised. Other things are much easier to lecture on. Utilitarianism is pretty easy. Egoism is very easy. Kant is difficult. I think everyone who teaches Kant says it's hard to explain it to students. In part, it's because in order to understand Kant's theory as a whole, you have to understand lots of different things. Let this hand be, I'm going to move this hand around. You've got to understand Kant's theory, you've got to understand this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And maybe some more stuff. You've got to understand what he means by willing something. You've got to understand what he means by willing something consistently or inconsistently. You've got to understand what a maxim is and what a generalized form of a maxim is. You've got to understand what an imperative is and what kinds of imperative there are, and lots of other things. You've got to understand what a universal law is, or a universal law of nature. And you can't really understand Kant's overall theory unless you understand all of its parts and how they work together. And that's what makes it so hard to lecture on Kant for undergraduate students like you. But I do my best. I've been teaching Kant for a long time. I'd like to think that every time I teach Kant, it gets a little better. Maybe I'm getting closer and closer to understanding Kant myself. But as your teacher, my goal is to help you understand the basic features of his theory. And that, of course, is what I'll test you on the exam. And we'll see how well you understood the concepts of a maxim, of willing, of a universal law, of consistent willing, universalizability, and these various examples that we've gone over. So there's a lot for you to study. I'm not going to apologize for that. Everyone who teaches ethics teaches the same topics like Kant and egoism and utilitarianism. So I'm not going to apologize for making you learn this. Kant's theory is still today one of the dominant theories of normative ethics, and every student should be aware of the basic features of it. Okay, enough for today. Have a great day, and tomorrow and weekend, I will see you back on the screen probably on Tuesday next week. So look for Tuesday and Thursday to be our two lectures. But again, I'll send you an email when they're posted. See you next week.